A man with $1 billion walked past the same janitor every night for 3 years and never once looked at his face. The janitor's name was Curtis. He pushed his cart down the 41st floor of the Halsey Tower at 9 o'clock, emptied the bins, wiped the glass, set the chairs straight, and left before the executives arrived in the morning. He had cleaned that floor for 20 years. He had cleaned the corner office at the end of the hall for 20 years. And he had no idea that the man who now sat behind that desk, the man whose name was on the building, was the same boy he had pulled out of the cold grey water of Pike Lake one August afternoon, 28 years before, when the boy was 9 years old and going under for the third time, and nobody else on that crowded shore had moved. Curtis had jumped in with his shoes on. He had carried the boy back to the sand and pressed the water out of his chest and waited until the small ribs rose and fell on their own. And then he had walked away before anyone thought to ask his name. He did not know the boy lived. He did not know the boy grew up. He did not know the boy was the reason he had a job at all. Stay with me, because the night the two of them finally stood in the same room and knew it, you're going to feel the floor shift under 20 years of being invisible. Curtis was 58 that winter. He had a bad knee, a daughter named Naya in her last year of nursing school, and a brass whistle on a worn cord that he had carried in his pocket every working day of his life. He didn't know yet that the whistle was about to change everything. He only knew the bins were full and the night was long and the rent was due on the 15th. Curtis Mayfield, no relation to the singer, a joke he had made so many times it had worn smooth, had not always pushed a cart. Once he had been a lifeguard. That was a long time ago, in a different city, in a summer when he was 30 and strong and could swim the length of a public pool underwater on a single breath. He had worked the municipal beach at Pike Lake for the Parks Department, $11 an hour, a red tank top, a whistle on a cord. He had loved it more than any work he had ever done. He had pulled 4 people out of that lake in 2 summers, 3 of them children, and he had never told anyone, because to Curtis a thing you did because it needed doing was not a thing you bragged about. Then the city cut the parks budget, and the beach closed, and the red tank top went in a drawer, and Curtis took the only steady work he could find, which was nights cleaning office towers downtown. He kept the whistle. He could not have said why. It sat in his pocket against the cleaning rags and the spare key. And sometimes when the floor was empty and the city glittered cold through the 41st floor glass, he would close his hand around it and remember the weight of water, and the feel of a small chest finally breathing under his palms. The lake had a smell he never forgot, green and cold, and a little of gasoline from the boats, and a sound, the slap of small waves on the wooden dock, and the shriek of children gone too far out. He had learned to read the surface the way other men read a newspaper. He could tell the difference between a child playing at drowning and a child actually doing it, and the difference was in the arms, the way the real ones went straight up and clawed at nothing and made no sound at all, because drowning is the quietest emergency there is. Nobody screams. They slip under, and the water closes over them like nothing happened. And if you are not watching the arms, you will miss it entirely. Curtis had watched the arms for 2 summers. He had been good at it the way a man is good at a thing he was made for and never chose. He had a daughter to raise alone. His wife had died when Nia was 6, a fast cancer that took 11 weeks and $40,000 they didn't have. And Curtis had buried her on a Tuesday and gone back to work on the Wednesday, because there was a child who needed shoes. Her name had been Renee. She had been a school teacher, 3rd grade, and she had a way of laughing that started low and built. And on the night she died, she had held his hand in the hospital and told him to make sure Nia learned to swim, because a child of his ought to know the water and not fear it. He had promised. He had taught Nia himself in the public pool on the south side, on his one night off, the summer she turned 7, holding her small stomach, flat on the surface of the water, while she kicked and sputtered and then, all at once, swam. He had wept in the pool that day and called it chlorine. He had kept the promise and most of the others, 1 packed lunch and 1 parent-teacher night and 1 second-hand prom dress at a time. He had been working nights ever since. 20 years. The same building, the same floor, the same long quiet that most people never see. The hour when a tower belongs only to the man who keeps it clean. The corner office at the end of the 41st floor belonged to a man named David Halsey. Curtis knew the name the way you know a name on a door, which is to say, not at all. He knew the man kept the office cold and the blinds half open. He knew the man worked late, later than any other executive. and that twice a week Curtis had to wait in the hall with his cart until the light under the door went dark. He knew the man had a photograph on his desk in a plain silver frame, a boy and a woman at a lake, and that the man sometimes sat looking at it when he thought no one could see. Curtis dusted around that frame for 3 years and never once turned it to the light. It was not his to touch. What Curtis did not know was that David Halsey had bought the Halsey Tower, had built the company that filled it, had done all of it carrying a single memory he had never been able to shake, the memory of going under in cold lake water at 9 years old and a pair of dark, strong hands hauling him up into the air. David had spent 30 years and a great deal of money trying to find the man those hands belonged to. He had hired investigators. He had run notices in 3 city papers. He had set up a foundation in the name of a man he could not name. And every one of those efforts had failed because the lifeguard had walked away before anyone took his name, and the Parks Department records from that summer had burned in a storage fire in 2003. And the only thing David Halsey had left of the man who saved his life was the sound of a whistle blowing twice across the water and a voice saying, "Easy now, son. I got you. I got you." David was 37 that winter. He had more money than he could spend in 5 lifetimes, 412 people on his payroll, and a hollow place in him that no amount of either had ever filled. He had grown up the only child of a single mother who cleaned houses, a woman named Della who had worked 3 of them a day, 6 days a week, and had still found the hour to sit with her son over his arithmetic at the kitchen table after the last bus brought her home. She had told him 1,000 times that a man is measured not by what he is given, but by what he gives back, and she had told him every August for the rest of her life the story of the afternoon a stranger gave him back to her at the edge of a lake. She had never seen the lifeguard's face either. She had been 30 feet up the beach with her eyes closed against the sun for one moment, one single moment. And when she opened them, her son was gone from the shallows, and a man in a red tank top was already in the water. She had carried the guilt of that closed moment to her grave and the gratitude beside it, and she had made David promise at the end that if he ever had the means, he would find the man and thank him properly. David had the means now. He had clawed his way through scholarship and night classes and a decade of 18-hour days, and somewhere in all of it, he had decided that the debt he owed was the largest debt a person can owe, the debt of a life, and that he would not rest until he had paid it. He could not pay it. The man was gone. So David did the only thing he could think to do, which was to be the kind of man worth saving. He paid his cleaning staff a living wage when the building managers told him he was a fool. He kept the photograph on his desk, and he worked late, every night, partly because the work was endless and partly because the empty tower at night reminded him of the lake at dusk, the quiet after the crowd had gone, the hour when his whole life had nearly ended, and a stranger had given it back. He had no idea that the stranger emptied his wastebasket 4 nights a week. The 2 of them had been 10 feet apart twice a week for 3 years. You might be thinking that someone should have noticed that in 3 years of crossing paths, a man would recognize the face that pulled him from the water. But David had been 9 years old and half drowned, his eyes stinging and his lungs full, and he had never seen the lifeguard's face clearly, only the shape of him against the white sky and the strength of his arms. And Curtis had been 30 and was now 58, grey now, heavier, slower, a different man on the outside than the one who had worn the red tank top. The lake was 400 miles and 28 years away. There was no reason on earth for either of them to know. If you have ever done a kindness and never learned what became of it, stay close, because this is a story about the long way a good thing travels before it comes home. Curtis would not have called what he did a kindness. He would have called it Tuesday. But the world keeps a ledger even when the people in it forget, and the Halsey Tower was about to balance an account 28 years overdue. The trouble started in February, and it started small, the way trouble does. The building changed cleaning contractors. The new company, Pro Clean Solutions, came in with lower bids, and a young area manager named Brett, who carried a tablet everywhere and called the workers his team in a way that made it clear he did not know any of their names. Brett was 29. He wore a lanyard and a half-zip pullover, and he had a binder of efficiency metrics he had built himself, and he believed in it the way some men believe in Scripture. His job was to cut costs, and the easiest cost to cut was people who had been there long enough to earn more than the minimum. Or Curtis, at 20 years, earned $19 an hour. A new hire earned $13. Brett did the arithmetic on his tablet and saw a number he could shrink. He started writing Curtis up for things that had never been problems before. A trash can missed on the 39th floor, though Curtis had not been assigned the 39th floor that week and could prove it with the schedule, which Brett did not ask to see. A streak on a window on the 41st that Brett photographed at an angle that caught the light, and that was gone the next morning when Curtis looked, because there had never been a streak, only an angle. A clock in, 90 seconds late on a night the freight elevator had stuck between the basement and the lobby with Curtis and his cart inside it for 11 minutes, which Brett knew because Curtis had called him from inside the stuck car, and which Brett wrote down anyway. 3 write-ups, Brett explained, his voice warm and terrible, and the company had no choice. It was policy. Nothing personal. Curtis stood in the basement break room under the buzzing tube light with his cap in his hands and the coffee machine ticking behind him, and felt 20 years thin out to nothing in the space of a sentence. He did not raise his voice. He had learned a long time ago that raising your voice to a man with a tablet only gave the man a 4th thing to write down. He asked Brett quietly whether 20 years counted for anything. Brett said that loyalty was wonderful, but the numbers were the numbers, and that Curtis was welcome to reapply at the new starting rate, $13 an hour, no seniority, a fresh probationary 90 days. Curtis did the math on the bus home. $13 an hour was $490 short a month of what he needed. Naya's last semester of nursing school cost $6,000 he had been paying down in pieces. The rent was $1,100. He sat in the dark of the apartment with the brass whistle in his hand and did not turn on the heat, because the heat was money. And he thought about the cold grey water of a lake he had not seen in 28 years, and how easy it had been then to know what the right thing was, and how hard it had become to afford it now. Naya found him like that when she came in from her shift at the hospital, still in her scrubs, her name badge crooked, 23 years old, and already carrying more than her share. She was the best thing Curtis had ever made, and he had made her mostly alone, on night wages, 1 packed lunch, and 1 parent-teacher night, and 1 second-hand prom dress at a time. She set her bag down by the door and saw him in the dark with no heat on, and knew before he said a word, the way children of a careful parent always know when the carefulness has finally cracked. She crossed the room and sat down beside him on the cold couch, and asked what was wrong, and Curtis, who had never once let her see him afraid, told her the truth, because he was too tired to lie. "They want me gone," he said. 20 years, and they want me gone, and they want me to thank them for the chance to start over at $13. Nia did not cry, though she wanted to. She had learned that from him too, that you save the crying for when it can do some good, and that in front of someone you love, it cannot. She took the whistle out of his hand and turned it over, the brass worn, smooth and warm from his pocket, and she asked him, as she had asked 100 times growing up, what the whistle was for. He had always told her the same short thing, that it was from before, from the lake. She had never pressed. Now she pressed it back into his palm, and folded his fingers over it, and said the thing she had said her whole life, the thing she had learned from watching him. "We'll figure it out, Dad. We always do." What neither of them knew was that the figuring out had already begun, 4 floors up and 3 years deep, in the quiet of a corner office where a man kept a photograph of a lake. Curtis went back to work because there was nothing else to do. He cleaned the 41st floor the way he had always cleaned it, with care, because the building did not deserve less just because the men who owned the contract deserved more. And on a Thursday night in late February, the thing happened that the whole story had been bending towards without anyone knowing. Curtis was working the corner office. The man, David Halsey, was still at his desk, later than usual, a glass of water sweating on a coaster and the city dark and glittering behind him. Curtis knocked the way he always did and said he could come back. David said no, come in, he was nearly done, pay him no mind. So Curtis worked quietly around the edges of the room, and as he leaned to empty the bin beside the desk, the cord slipped, the way an old cord will, and the brass whistle fell out of his shirt pocket and hit the marble floor with a small, bright sound and rolled to a stop against the leg of David Halsey's desk. David looked down at it. He did not move for a moment. Then he bent and picked it up, and he turned it over in his fingers, and Curtis saw the man's face change in a way he didn't understand, saw the colour leave it, saw the hand begin to shake. It was an ordinary lifeguard's whistle, brass gone soft and dark with handling, the kind the Parks Department had issued by the hundreds. There was nothing remarkable about it, except that David Halsey had heard a whistle exactly like it, blow twice across cold water on the worst and best afternoon of his life, and he had spent 30 years trying to find the man it belonged to. He looked up at the janitor he had passed 1,000 times and never seen, the grey, heavy, quiet man in the grey uniform, and he asked, in a voice that did not sound like his own, where he had gotten the whistle. Curtis said it was his, from a long time ago. He used to guard a beach before this work up north, a lake called Pike. The city closed it years back. He reached out for the whistle, a little embarrassed, an old man's keepsake fallen on a rich man's floor, but David did not give it back. David stood up behind the desk and he turned the silver-frame photograph around so it faced Curtis, the boy and the woman at a lake, and he asked Curtis if he would look at it. Curtis looked. He saw a thin, dark-haired boy of about 9, soaking wet, wrapped in a towel on a strip of sand, and a young woman kneeling beside him with both hands pressed to her mouth, and behind them the grey water of a lake he knew, a lake he had pulled 4 people out of in 2 summers. 3 of them children. He felt something move at the back of his memory like a fish under ice. He said he did not understand. David Halsey said, "That boy is me. That woman is my mother. That is Pike Lake, the summer I was 9. I went under 3 times and a lifeguard came in with his shoes on and brought me back, and I never saw his face and I never got his name, and I have been looking for him for 30 years. He held the whistle out on his open palm, the brass catching the light, and his voice broke clean in half. "It was you," he said. "It was you. You blew this whistle twice and you said, 'Easy now, son. I got you. You saved my life and you walked away. And I have been trying to thank you since before I had $1 to my name.'" The room was very quiet. Curtis stood with the cart at his side and the bin in his hand and looked at the boy from the lake, grown into a man, standing in a corner office at the top of a tower with the whole city dark below, and he felt 28 years fold up like a map until the 2 afternoons touched, the one on the sand and the one in the glass. And he understood. He had carried that boy out of the water. He had pressed the breath back into that small chest. He had walked away and never known the ribs kept rising and falling, that they were rising and falling still, here, now, in this room. He did not say anything grand. There was nothing grand in him. He said, "You lived." That was all. 2 words, 30 years late. You lived. And then this 58-year-old man who had buried a wife and raised a daughter on night wages and never once let anyone see him weep, put his hand over his face and his shoulders shook, and David Halsey came around the desk and took hold of him. And the 2 of them stood in the cold corner office and wept like the water was still coming off them both. It came out slowly over the next hour, in the broken pieces that true things come out in. David sat Curtis down in the good chair, the one for visiting board members, deep leather that had cost more than a month of Curtis's rent, and brought him a glass of water with his own hands and would not let him leave. He told Curtis about the foundation he had built in the name of a man he could not name, the David and Unknown Lifeguard Fund, the scholarships it gave to the children of public pool workers and parks employees, the 11 young people it had put through college in the name of a stranger. He pulled their photographs up on his screen, one after another, a nursing student, a welder, a girl studying marine biology because she had grown up around water her father guarded, and he told Curtis their names, and Curtis sat with the glass of water going warm in his hand and understood that the afternoon he had forgotten by Tuesday had been quietly putting children through school for 30 years without his knowing. He told Curtis about the investigators. 3 different firms across 3 decades, the newspaper notices that ran every August in 3 cities, the park's records that had burned in a storage fire in 2003 and taken the last paper trail with them. He told him that the photograph had sat on every desk he had ever owned, in the dorm room and the first cramped office above a laundromat, and now here at the top of the tower, because he had promised his mother on her deathbed that he would never let the debt grow cold. And Curtis told David about the red tank top and the $11 an hour and the budget cuts and the nights cleaning towers and a girl named Nia in her last year of nursing school and a wife named Renee buried on a Tuesday with a return to work on the Wednesday and a promise about teaching a child to swim that he had kept in a public pool on his one night off. He did not tell it to ask for anything. He told it because the man across the desk had asked, and because after 20 years of being invisible, it was a strange and enormous thing to be seen. To have another human being lean forward and want the whole of your small, ordinary life and call it a treasure. Then David asked the question that turned the night, the question that turned the whole 28 years. He asked how long Curtis had worked in the building. 20 years, Curtis said. The same floor. This floor. David went very still. 20 years, he said. You have cleaned this office for 20 years. And I have sat here for 3 of them looking at that photograph and never knew the man in it was emptying my trash. Curtis almost smiled. He said the building had changed hands a few times and the cleaning company just last month, and that, as a matter of fact, he was on his way out the door for good. 3 write-ups, company policy, nothing personal, $13 an hour if he wanted to reapply from the bottom. David Halsey asked the name of the cleaning company and the name of the area manager, and Curtis told him, and something settled into the rich man's face that was not anger exactly, but was very close to it. The look of a man who has just found out that the one person on earth he owes everything to is about to be thrown out of his building for the crime of having worked there too long and too well. David did not raise his voice either. He had learned, like Curtis, that the loud thing is rarely the strong thing. He made one phone call that night to the head of building operations, a steady woman named Carla, who had run the towers day to day for 9 years and had always thought well of the quiet janitor on 41. He made 2 more calls the next morning, one to the legal department and one to a man on his own board who happened to own a controlling interest in Pro Clean Solutions. He did not threaten. He did not need to. He simply asked questions, the kind of plain questions a careful man asks, and let the answers do the work. By the time Brett arrived at the basement office that Friday with his tablet and his half-zip pullover and his warm, terrible smile, there was a letter waiting for him on Carla's desk, and the letter did not concern Curtis. It concerned a pattern of pretextual write-ups, age and tenure discrimination, and the immediate review of the entire Pro-Clean contract by the building's owner, who, it turned out, took a personal interest in the dignity of the people who kept his tower clean. Brett read the letter twice. The colour went out of his face the way it goes out of a man who has just understood that the small, invisible person he was stepping on was standing on something he could not see. He asked Carla if there had been some mistake. Carla said there had been, and that Brett had made it, and that the owner would like to see him upstairs on the 41st floor in the corner office now. What David Halsey did next, he did carefully, because he understood that you can break a proud man by helping him the wrong way, and Curtis Mayfield was the proudest man he had ever met. He did not simply hand Curtis money, though he had thought about it, a cheque large enough to end every hard arithmetic of Curtis's life in a single stroke. He knew Curtis would not take it, so instead he made an offer that was also a truth. He told Curtis that the building had needed a director of facilities for 2 years and had never found the right one, someone who understood the place from the ground up, who knew every floor and every pipe and every dead spot in the heating and every late-working soul in it, who would be paid what such knowledge was worth, which was a great deal more than $19 an hour, and who would never again be written up by a boy with a tablet, because he would be the one the boys with tablets answered to. Curtis said he was a janitor. He said it plainly, not in shame, because there was no shame in it, only the honest weight of a word a man has worn for 20 years. David said he was the man who had kept the Halsey Tower running for 20 years, and that the title had simply been wrong the whole time, that the building had been calling him a janitor while leaning its whole self on his care. Curtis said he had a bad knee and a year left in him, maybe 2. David said then he had a year, maybe 2, to train the people who would come after him, to teach them which valves stuck in January and which freight car you did not trust past the 30th floor, and how you spoke to a frightened night worker so they did not feel small, and a pension at the end of it that meant he would never push a cart or count out a bus fare in the dark again. Curtis was quiet a long moment. He looked at the photograph on the desk, the boy and the grey water, and then passed it to the black glass, and the city far below, all those lit windows, all those lives. And he thought about a girl in scrubs with a crooked name badge and $6,000 of nursing school left to pay, and a wife who had asked him to teach their child not to fear the water. He said yes. He said it quietly. He had learned a long time ago that the quiet yes is the one that holds. The foundation paid for the rest of Nia's nursing school, all $6,000 in the name of the lifeguard the fund had been built to honour, which everyone in the room understood was now no longer unknown. The board voted that spring to change the name on the door of the fund. It read from then on, the Curtis Mayfield Fund, and below it, in smaller letters, for the ones who watch the water. Nia graduated that spring in a hall full of families, and when the dean read the long list of names, she crossed the stage in her white coat with her chin up, and somewhere near the front, her father and a man worth $4 billion stood at the same moment to clap for her, two pairs of hands among hundreds, no different from any of the rest. Curtis sat in the third row in a suit David Halsey had quietly seen to, the first suit Curtis had owned since Renee's funeral, and when his daughter took her diploma, he held the brass whistle in his pocket and pressed it the way he had pressed it through 20 years of empty midnights. And this time, it did not feel like a thing he was keeping for no reason. It felt like a receipt. Finally stamped paid. David sat beside him with his eyes wet and did not pretend they weren't. The two men had become something the world does not have a clean word for. Not quite father and son, though David had lost his mother years before and Curtis had no son. Not quite friends, though they were that too, but something older and stranger, two people bound by a single afternoon in cold water, one who gave a life and one who carried it forward and spent 30 years trying to make it worth the giving. Have you ever wondered whether the small good thing you did, the thing you forgot by Tuesday, the thing nobody saw, ever landed anywhere at all? Tell me about it in the comments. I think you would be surprised how far a thing like that can travel. A year later, Curtis Mayfield retired from the Halsey Tower as its director of facilities, with a pension, a watch he did not want and accepted anyway, and a party in the lobby that 400 people came to, every one of whom now knew his name. They had made a banner, the cleaning crews and the assistants and the executives all together, and it did not say director, it said the man who kept the lights on. And Curtis had stood under it with his cap in his hands the same way he had once stood in the basement break room, except that this time the room was full and the room was for him. He bought a small house with a porch on the east side of the city, the first house he had ever owned, with a yard big enough for a garden and a swing. He hung for the grandchildren he hoped were coming, and he put the brass whistle on a nail by the door where he could see it when he came and went. Nia worked the paediatric floor at the county hospital now, and she was good at it, gentle and unhurried with frightened children, patient with the ones who fought the needle, and tender with the ones who had stopped fighting anything at all. And she had learned that, like everything she knew that mattered, from a man who had once pulled drowning children out of a lake and never told a soul. David Halsey came for dinner on Sundays. He had a key. The photograph of the boy and the lake had moved from the corner office to a shelf in Curtis's living room, where it sat beside a photograph of Nia in her white coat, and sometimes the three of them would look at the two pictures side by side and not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. On the porch of that small house, on a warm evening in late summer, 29 years and one whole life after the afternoon at Pike Lake, Curtis sat in a chair that was his, in front of a door that was his, with his daughter laughing in the kitchen and a rich man who owed him everything setting the table without being asked. The brass whistle hung on its nail by the door, dark and worn, and finally at rest. Curtis had not blown it in 28 years. He did not need to. The boy it had called across the water had heard it all this time and had come, and had brought a whole life with him to lay down at the feet of the man who had given it. Kindness, it turned out, kept a longer memory than Curtis ever had. He had forgotten the boy by the following Tuesday. The boy had remembered him for 30 years. And somewhere in the difference between those two facts is the whole reason a tired man should jump into cold water with his shoes on, even when no one is watching, even when he will never know what becomes of it. Curtis closed his hand around the whistle one last time that evening, out of habit, the way you touch a thing you love. Then he let it go, and he went inside to his family, and the porch light stayed warm against the dark. If this story moved you, there is another one waiting just like it, about a waitress who left the same small tip every day for 6 years, and the table that finally turned around to thank her. Go and watch it now. Some kindnesses take the long way home, but they always come home.